So let's go ahead and start looking at some of these controls that are available to you in your iOS development. So the first thing that you'll notice is Interface Builder here. I've got a sample application that I've brought up here using a utility application just so we can demo some of these controls and what they look like. And we're going to focus on the Interface Builder part of this for this module. So I'm not really going to go into the code to show how to manipulate these things, but it's pretty straightforward when you get into the control to know how to manipulate it. And we've covered some of this in the previous module. So the first thing to notice here in Interface Builder is this objects tree. And this is basically going to be the tree of objects that you have. If we were to look at this here, you can see that there is a button, the button that was automatically created in this template for this utilities. And you can see that if I drag things onto here, it puts them into this tree hierarchy, and I can manipulate the way that this tree is created here. Also, you can see here that I'm looking at this property editor for the controls on here, and the one that you'll be most interested in is the attributes inspector, which is this tab that I have selected, and that's what we're going to cover really as we're going over these controls. So the first thing to look at here is the label control, and one thing I want to say about these controls is they're a lot more dynamic than they appear. You have to kind of look into the settings, but you can do a lot of different things with the controls. They're very user friendly, and a lot of things that you would think you would need to customize in iOS, you don't actually need to. The control can already do it. So looking at a label control, this is just like a label in any kind of UI environment that you've used before, except it has a lot more options than you've probably seen. So we'll just cover some of these options that I think you might find useful. And we'll do that for all the controls. So for a label here, of course, you have the text, and you can double click and set your text here. Testing 1, 2, 3. And then this is an interesting aspect, this line break. So let's say that if I have the text, in fact, let me fix this text. We'll just adjust to fit. If I uncheck this, the text is not going to adjust to fit the size of the bounding box for it. By default, it is set to adjust to fit. But if I disable that, then you can see that we have some logic to handle how the line breaks handle when it's over those bounds. So it's set to default to truncate tail, but you can see truncate middle or truncate head will produce a different effect there. You can word wrap it, character wrap it, or you could just even clip the text. So you have a lot of options there that you can utilize. You can of course set the alignment on the text, the number of lines that are going to be in here. You can of course control the fonts and text colors, and you can add a shadow to your text, which is kind of neat. So I mean, you do have a lot of options here for this. So the other thing that you can do with this is all of the controls here are going to have this basic set here, which is going to allow you to control the alpha, transparency level, the background, add a tag, and do some stretching if you want it onto the control. We won't get too much into this, but the one thing I did want to point out here is this alpha, which is really useful if you want to create transparent controls. If you wanted this control to be somewhat see-through, an alpha of 1 is going to make it completely opaque, but if you reduce that alpha level, you'd be able to make the controls transparent, and this is pretty much going to apply to all of the controls. The next control on our list here is the button, and it's called a round rect button, but it really actually does a lot more than just that. There's some options here on the button type, and by default this round rect button we can just put in our text here, and it looks like the standard button that you normally see. But we can also change the type of this button to some of the familiar buttons that you may have seen in iOS. This detail disclosure, this info button, just like we had before. There's a dark version of it. And then this contact. So you've got that kind of built in right there. You can also use a custom button and set an image for it and completely control that yourself. So here we can also set, of course, you can set the background color, the shadow. I think those are pretty obvious. There's not too much else interesting here except for this alignment here where you can align the text. So if I put some text in here, we can make it left aligned or right aligned. Kind of useful feature or stretch to it. You can also set whether the button's highlighted or selected and enabled. And those are pretty standard options. So button, pretty dynamic, can do a lot of stuff there. The segmented control. This is kind of a control that is kind of new to iOS that I don't think really exists in a lot of other UIs. The basic functionality of this is to allow a selection between some finite number of things. So I could add more segments to this, and we could create a segment called third here, and then you would see you could choose between these 3 items. It also, just like a lot of the other controls, has a few different styles. So we could do a bordered style, and we could do a bar style, and this bezeled style here. So you've got those options there. We can of course set the titles on each segment here, or an image if you wanted to use an image. And again, the alignment, just like you could do with the buttons. This is kind of a useful control to use to limit the selection, which is something that you're going to want to do in a mobile app. A lot of times it's easier if you don't have to have the user type in text, and it's nice for them to be able to see all of their selections. This is something where instead of using a drop down, you might use this control, especially if you only have a few options, and then they can see all their options and select them. If we look at the text field, this text field, again, another one of those basic controls that you've seen before, but this does have a couple of nice features that I really like in iOS. One of them is this placeholder text. So I could put in, like, enter password here, and then you'll see that it's going to show it here to let the user know what they're supposed to enter into there. You can do some border styling here. I'm not too sure that I really like the way that the border styling is. The default one seems to look the best to me. You can have this clear button setting, and what this does is basically affects whether or not there's going to be a little circle here with an X and when that appears. So you can make it appear while editing, unless you're editing, or always visible. And this can be nice to use when you have some large amount of text or some pre-populated text and you want to make it real easy for them to clear that text. You see that a lot in search functionality nowadays. Of course, you can set the font and whatnot. The other interesting thing here is the capitalization. You can set it to automatically do this capitalization based on words, sentences, or all characters, which is pretty convenient. You can turn on correction off or on. You can use these different types of keyboards for the entry here. So there's a bunch of different selections here, especially if you're doing something like a phone number or an email address. You really want to use the right keyboard here. Otherwise, you're going to frustrate your user when they're having to type the whole email address instead of having the .com button or whatever it may be that's specific to that text field. The return key is another feature that's really important here. This is what's going to show for the return button on the keyboard that comes up. And sometimes something like a send or done is nice here to make it really indicate to the user that will perform an action, not just go on to the next line.